It was a crisp autumn morning, and the sun cast a golden light over the sprawling flea market. Ethan wandered aimlessly between the crowded stalls, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. He had no particular agenda, just enjoying the weekend, soaking in the atmosphere, and maybe finding something interesting to take home. As he passed a cluttered booth selling vintage trinkets and antiques, something caught his eye. It was an old mirror, leaning against a wooden crate at the back of the stall. Unlike the other items which looked dusty and worn, the mirror seemed almost pristine despite its age. The frame was made of dark wood, intricately carved with swirling patterns, giving it an aura of elegance that stood out amid the clutter. Ethan approached the mirror, running his fingers along the smooth wood, admiring the craftsmanship. The surface of the glass reflected the overcast sky and the bustling market, but there was something about it, something that drew him in. He couldn't quite explain it, but the mirror felt like it belonged to him. "Beautiful piece, isn't it?" A raspy voice interrupted his thoughts. Ethan turned to see the vendor, an elderly man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, watching him intently. "Yeah," Ethan replied, glancing back at the mirror. "How much?" The old man's lips curled into a thin smile. "For you? $50. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's all? Let's just say I'm eager to part with it." The vendor's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. He lowered his voice and leaned in slightly. "But be warned, son. That mirror's got a history. Some say it's seen things that don't belong in this world." Ethan chuckled, thinking it was part of the vendor's sales pitch. "What, like ghosts?" The old man didn't laugh. He just stared at Ethan for a moment before replying. "Let's just say, it's been passed around a lot. People don't tend to keep it long." Ethan shrugged off the warning. He wasn't one for superstitions, and the mirror was too nice to pass up for such a low price. He handed the man a crumpled $50 bill, which the vendor took with a nod. "Take care of it," the vendor said, almost as an afterthought. "You never know who might be watching." Ethan rolled his eyes but offered a polite smile as he hoisted the mirror into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, and he had to steady himself as he carried it back to his car. By the time he got home, the morning sun had given way to gray clouds, casting his small apartment in dim light. Ethan set the mirror down against the living room wall, wiping his brow. He took a step back to admire it, pleased with how it added a touch of character to the room. For a moment, he stared at his reflection. There was something about the way the mirror captured light. His image seemed sharper, more defined than in any other mirror he owned. It made him look different, somehow. Taller? More serious? He couldn't quite put his finger on it. He shook off the odd feeling and went about the rest of his day, busying himself with chores and errands. By evening, he had almost forgotten about the mirror. But as the apartment grew darker and the shadows stretched across the walls, he found himself drawn back to it. He stood before the mirror once more, looking at his reflection in the faint light of a nearby lamp. There was nothing unusual, just him, standing alone in his living room. But then, just as he was about to turn away, something flickered in the corner of the glass. A shadow? A movement? Ethan blinked and stared harder, his heart picking up speed. Nothing. Just his reflection, the empty room behind him, and the faint hum of the city outside his window. Shaking his head, he laughed under his breath. "Get a grip, man," he muttered to himself. He turned off the lamp and headed to bed, not noticing the faint outline of a figure that lingered in the mirror long after he left the room. The following day, Ethan almost forgot about the mirror entirely. The usual Monday routine kicked in, work, meetings, and endless emails kept him occupied. By the time he returned to his apartment that evening, he was exhausted, barely acknowledging the mirror as he tossed his keys on the counter and collapsed onto the couch. But as he glanced around his small living room, his eyes were inexplicably drawn back to it. The mirror was hard to ignore, as if it commanded attention without doing anything at all. It stood there quietly, reflecting the muted light of his floor lamp, casting an image of the room that was too crisp for his liking. He stood and walked over to it again, almost reflexively. His reflection stared back, tired but otherwise normal. He sighed and turned away. That's when he saw it. Just a flicker, a shadow darting across the corner of the glass. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. Slowly, he turned back to face the mirror, expecting to see nothing more than his own worn-out face. But this time, he saw something. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint blur, as if the reflection was just a little off. Ethan leaned in closer, studying the glass. It looked as though there was a smudge on the surface, but when he reached out to wipe it away, his hand hesitated. Something was wrong. The smudge was not on the glass, it was behind him. He whipped around, scanning the room. Nothing. Just his living room, exactly as it should be. The couch, the coffee table, the TV, all perfectly in place. His chest tightened as he turned back to the mirror. The smudge had changed. It wasn't just a blur anymore. It was something. A shape, indistinct, but definitely there. It was tall and narrow, like a silhouette. And it was standing right behind him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He turned again, this time slower, half expecting to see someone standing in the room. But once again, there was nothing. The apartment was as empty as it had always been. Okay, I'm losing it, he muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes and stepping back from the mirror. The longer he looked at it, the more uneasy he felt. His apartment had always been his sanctuary, his safe place, but now, it felt different. Off. He tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just overtired. It had been a long day, after all. Still, the uneasy feeling gnawed at him as he went about his evening, trying to ignore the nagging sensation that something was watching him. As the hours passed, he tried to distract himself, cooking dinner, flipping through channels, checking his phone. But every now and then, his eyes would drift toward the mirror. And every time he looked, he swore he saw something different. The shadows behind his reflection seemed to shift, subtly at first, then more noticeably. Ethan woke up the next morning with a start, his body tangled in the sheets, drenched in sweat. His heart pounded in his chest, the remnants of a nightmare fading from his mind. In the dream, he had been standing in front of the mirror, unable to move, while shadows shifted and grew behind him, pressing closer and closer. He'd felt their presence, their eyes on him, watching. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, he swung his legs out of bed and forced himself to focus on the morning. He made coffee, showered, and tried to settle into his routine. But every time he passed through the living room, the mirror caught his eye. It was still there, leaning against the wall, reflecting the soft morning light. It looked ordinary, like any other mirror would. Yet Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen the night before. The figure. The way it seemed to stand there, motionless, but somehow alive. He paced around the apartment, avoiding the mirror as much as possible. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe he was just tired. After all, stress and exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. That had to be it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Something darker. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He approached the mirror again, his breath shallow. His reflection greeted him, just his own tired face, the living room behind him, empty. And yet, as he stared, something began to shift. At first, it was subtle. The light in the room dimmed slightly, as though a cloud had passed over the sun. Then, in the far corner of the mirror, he saw it. The figure. It wasn't a blur this time. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a person. Ethan's throat tightened. The figure was clearer now, tall, thin, and dressed in old-fashioned clothes. A man, with sharp, angular features, stood just behind him in the reflection, motionless, staring directly at him. His eyes were dark, hollow, and they bored into Ethan's with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Ethan spun around, his heart in his throat, but the room was empty. Nothing. He turned back to the mirror, half expecting the figure to be gone. But it wasn't. The man was still there, still standing just behind him, watching. Ethan's mouth went dry. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, but the figure didn't disappear. It was real, at least, it was real in the reflection. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine as the man's lips curled into a faint, twisted smile. "What the hell?" Ethan whispered, stepping back from the mirror. His hands trembled as he wiped his face, trying to calm himself down. But the man didn't go away. In fact, he wasn't alone anymore. There were others. From the edges of the mirror, more figures appeared, slipping into the reflection like shadows coming to life. A woman with long, dark hair stood near the door, her eyes wide and vacant. Another man, shorter, stockier, stood by the window, his face expressionless. And there were more. So many more, each one staring at Ethan with the same eerie, lifeless gaze. Ethan's pulse raced. He backed up until he hit the edge of the couch, unable to tear his eyes away from the mirror. The figures didn't move, they just stood there, watching, waiting. The room around him was empty, but in the mirror, it was crowded with people who shouldn't be there. People who couldn't be there. He swallowed hard, his mind racing for an explanation. This couldn't be real. There had to be a logical reason for this. He squeezed his eyes shut and counted to 5, hoping that when he opened them, the figures would be gone. But when he opened his eyes, the watchers were still there, standing perfectly still, their cold, dead eyes fixed on him. Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled away from the mirror, nearly tripping over the coffee table. He didn't care where he went. He just needed to get out of the room, away from those eyes. He hurried into the kitchen, gripping the counter for support, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. He tried to focus, to piece together what he had just seen, but the image of those figures, those watchers, kept creeping into his mind. Was he losing it? Was this some kind of hallucination? Stress? Anxiety? He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He needed to talk to someone, anyone. But as he stared at the screen, he realized he didn't know who to call. What was he supposed to say? That his mirror was showing him people who weren't there. He nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling under his skin. He glanced toward the living room, half expecting to see the figures walking out of the mirror, crossing into the real world. Ethan took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair. This was crazy. He needed to do something, anything to take his mind off it. So he grabbed his jacket and left the apartment, trying to shake the sense of dread that clung to him like a shadow. But as he locked the door behind him and stepped out into the street, he couldn't help but wonder if the figures in the mirror were still there. Watching, waiting. Ethan spent the next few days in a state of increasing paranoia. The figures in the mirror didn't go away. Every time he passed the mirror, whether it was morning or night, whether the room was lit or dark, they were there. Always watching, always present. He avoided spending time in the living room, but no matter how hard he tried, the pull of the mirror kept him coming back. There was something unnatural about it, something that demanded his attention, as if it held answers just beyond his understanding. The more he thought about it, the more he felt the need to know what he was dealing with. It was driving him mad. One night, after yet another encounter with the watchers in the reflection, Ethan decided he couldn't take it anymore. He had to find out where the mirror had come from. He needed answers. He grabbed his laptop and started researching antique mirrors, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what he was experiencing. Hours passed as he scoured the internet for similar stories, articles about haunted objects, cursed antiques, and supernatural phenomena. But nothing seemed to match his situation exactly. Frustrated, Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This was ridiculous. There had to be a logical explanation. Mirrors were just objects, after all, pieces of glass and wood. Whatever he was seeing, it had to be some kind of optical illusion, right? But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The figures in the mirror were too real, too distinct, and they were getting clearer. His mind drifted back to the vendor at the flea market, the man's cryptic warning about the mirror's history. Ethan had brushed it off at the time, but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. What had the old man meant? Could he know more about the mirror? Without hesitating, Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. He had to find the vendor again. The flea market was open every weekend, and Ethan returned there with a sense of urgency gnawing at him. He weaved through the familiar stalls, his eyes scanning for the booth where he'd found the mirror. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted it, tucked away in a far corner, just as before. The vendor was there, sitting on a stool, smoking a cigarette. He looked up as Ethan approached, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as if he'd been expecting him. "You're back," the old man said, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. "I figured you might be." Ethan swallowed, suddenly unsure how to begin. I need to know more about that mirror. The one I bought from you." The vendor raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong with it?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's not normal. There's something strange about the reflection. I keep seeing things. People, who aren't there." The vendor sighed, shaking his head as if he'd heard it all before. "I told you it had a history." "What kind of history?" Ethan asked, leaning in. "Please, I need to know." The old man took another drag from his cigarette before tossing it to the ground and grinding it out with his boot. "That mirror's been passed around a lot over the years. I've had it in my hands 3 times now. Every time, it finds its way back to me. People buy it, but they never keep it for long. Why? Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. The vendor's gaze darkened. Because it shows things that shouldn't be seen. Some folks say it's haunted. Others think it's cursed. But the truth is, nobody really knows where it came from. It's old, older than you'd think. And whoever looks into it too long, well, they start to see them. Ethan's blood ran cold. Them? The Watchers, the vendor said simply. Spirits, maybe. Souls trapped on the other side. People say the mirror is like a window, except it doesn't just show you your reflection. It shows you who's watching from the other side. Ethan's mind raced, the pieces starting to come together. The figures in the mirror weren't just hallucinations. They were real, in some way. They were watching him. But why me? Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Why am I seeing them? The vendor shrugged. Could be anything. Maybe the mirror chose you. Maybe they did. All I know is, once you see them, they don't go away. They just get closer. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. What am I supposed to do? How do I get rid of it? The old man gave a grim smile. I can take it back, if you want. But destroying it, well, that's another matter. Mirrors like that don't break easy. Ethan stared at the vendor, his mind racing. He didn't want to keep the mirror, but the thought of getting rid of it filled him with a strange, almost possessive fear. What if he needed to understand it more before he could part with it? He took a deep breath, steeling himself. No, not yet. I'll figure it out. The vendor nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Suit yourself. But be careful. The more time you spend with that mirror, the more they'll see you too. With that, the old man turned away, lighting another cigarette and disappearing back into the shadows of his booth. Ethan walked away, his thoughts in turmoil. The mirror wasn't just an object anymore. It was something far more dangerous, far more alive. And the Watchers, they weren't just passively watching. They were waiting. The air in Ethan's apartment felt colder than usual. He tried to convince himself it was just his nerves, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Ever since he'd spoken with the vendor, the mirror had become more than just a mysterious object. It was something alive, something that seemed to respond to his fear. That night, after tossing and turning in bed for hours, Ethan gave up on sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the figures in the mirror, the vendor's warning ringing in his ears. The more time you spend with that mirror, the more they'll see you too. He threw on a hoodie and walked into the living room, which was bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights outside. The mirror loomed in the corner, its dark wooden frame glistening faintly in the dim light. Ethan stood there for a moment, just staring at it, his pulse quickening. The apartment was silent, but he could feel the weight of something unseen, pressing down on him. He approached the mirror slowly, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his ears. At first, there was nothing. Just his own reflection, his tired face staring back at him, the living room behind him. But then they appeared, the Watchers. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were clearer now, more distinct. The tall, thin man was standing closest, his angular face etched with a cold, blank expression. Behind him, the woman with the long dark hair, her eyes wide and unblinking, stood by the window. And farther back, more figures, too many to count, hovered like shadows, their forms eerily still. Ethan felt his mouth go dry. His fingers trembled as he stepped closer to the mirror, his eyes locked on the figures. They didn't move, they never moved, but their presence was suffocating, their eyes, if that's what they were, following his every movement. What do you want? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The figures didn't respond, they just stood there, watching. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe some kind of reaction. Maybe for the figures to disappear like they had before. But they didn't. They were rooted there, their expressions unchanging, their eyes fixed on him. And then, in the stillness, something happened. The tall man in the mirror blinked. Ethan's stomach dropped. He staggered back, his eyes wide. The man had blinked. The Watchers had never moved before, not like that. They had always been statues, lifeless shadows. But now they were changing. Ethan's heart raced as he stood frozen, his body refusing to move. The tall man blinked again, this time more deliberately, his expression shifting ever so slightly. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The Watchers were becoming more aware of him. More real. The air in the room grew colder, and Ethan's skin prickled with a sudden sense of dread. He took a step back, his eyes darting between the figures in the mirror. The others hadn't moved, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all on the verge of something dangerous. "Stop it," Ethan muttered under his breath, more to himself than to them. His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Just stop." But the watchers didn't stop. They just stood there, staring. Waiting. Ethan backed away until he bumped into the couch. His pulse pounded in his throat, and his thoughts were spiraling. He needed to get out of the apartment, get away from the mirror, away from the eyes that never stopped watching him. He couldn't stay there any longer. Not tonight. Without another glance at the mirror, Ethan grabbed his keys and rushed out of the apartment. The cool night air hit him like a wave, calming the panic that had gripped him just moments before. But even as he walked the dark, quiet streets, his mind couldn't escape the image of those eyes in the mirror. He could still feel them, locked on him, wherever he went. Ethan didn't return home until morning. He spent the night walking aimlessly around the city, stopping at a diner for coffee, anything to keep his mind off the mirror. But as the sun rose, he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. His apartment was his only home, and the mirror was still there, waiting for him. When he finally stepped through the door, the apartment felt different. Still cold, still quiet, but the oppressive sense of being watched had eased. He dared to glance at the mirror from across the room. Empty. Just his reflection. No figures. No watchers. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Maybe they were gone. Maybe leaving the apartment had somehow broken the connection. He didn't know how these things worked, but it felt like a small relief. But as he stepped closer to the mirror, something caught his eye. A smudge on the glass. No, not a smudge, a handprint. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The handprint was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't his. It couldn't be. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing the cool glass. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. The air grew colder, and Ethan felt a presence, stronger, closer than before. He stared at the handprint, his breath catching in his throat. The watchers weren't gone. They were closer than ever. The handprint on the mirror haunted Ethan's thoughts long after he had first seen it. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had crossed over, that the watchers were no longer just trapped in the glass but were slowly finding ways to affect his world. He should have taken the vendor's offer. He should have gotten rid of the mirror when he had the chance. But now it was too late. The mirror had become an obsession, an ever-present fixture in his life that he couldn't escape. Days passed, and Ethan found himself drawn to it more and more. Every morning before work, he stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, waiting to see them. Every night before bed, he checked the glass again, hoping, dreading, that they might return. It was exhausting, draining him of the energy he once had. His job performance slipped. He missed meetings, avoided friends, and barely ate. He spent hours just sitting on the couch, his eyes flicking toward the mirror, searching for any sign of movement. The watchers weren't always there, but when they appeared, they seemed more vivid, more alive. They moved subtly now, blinking, shifting their weight, their eyes following him as he walked around the room. They didn't speak, but their presence was louder than words. It filled the room, suffocating him with their silence. One evening, as Ethan sat in front of the mirror again, something changed. The watchers had returned, the tall man and the woman with the long dark hair, as well as the countless others, standing in the background. But this time, they weren't standing still. The woman's head tilted, just slightly, as though she were studying him. Her wide, vacant eyes bore into his, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. She raised her hand slowly, her pale fingers brushing the air in front of her, as if trying to reach through the glass. Ethan's breath hitched. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned closer, unable to tear his eyes away. She was moving. They were all moving now, in small, subtle ways that made his skin crawl. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The watchers remained silent, their movements slow, deliberate, like creatures in a dream. The woman's hand pressed against the glass of the mirror, her fingers splayed out, leaving no doubt that she was reaching for him. Ethan's eyes flicked to his own reflection, and his blood ran cold. There was something wrong with it. His reflection wasn't mimicking his movements anymore. While he leaned forward, his reflection remained still, staring back at him with a blank, distant expression. He stumbled back, heart racing. His reflection's eyes followed him as he moved, but it wasn't reacting the way it should. It was delayed, like a glitch, or worse, like someone else was controlling it. "Stop," Ethan muttered, his voice breaking. "This isn't real." But the reflection didn't stop. It continued to stare, its face emotionless, as though it were watching him now. The reflection's eyes no longer seemed like his own. They were hollow, lifeless, just like the watchers behind him. Ethan's mind spun as he clutched his head, trying to make sense of it all. Was he losing control? Was his reflection no longer his own? He couldn't tell what was real anymore. The lines between himself and the mirror were blurring. He grabbed his phone, desperate to talk to someone, to hear another voice, anything to pull him out of the spiraling fear. But as he scrolled through his contacts, his hand froze. His finger hovered over the name of his ex-girlfriend, Emily. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but suddenly, the thought of calling her seemed right. She'd always been a calming presence in his life. Maybe she could help him get his head straight, give him some perspective. Anything was better than drowning in this madness alone. Without overthinking it, Ethan pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Emily's voice was cautious, as if she wasn't sure who would be calling her from this number. "Hey, it's me, Ethan," he said, his voice shaky. "I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you. Something weird has been happening, and I don't know who else to call." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might hang up. But then she sighed softly. "Okay, what's going on?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to begin. How did he explain this? That he had a haunted mirror in his apartment? That the figures inside were coming to life? "It's hard to explain," he finally said. I think there's something wrong with my apartment. There's this mirror I bought, and..." "A mirror?" Emily cut in, her voice suddenly sharp. "Wait, Ethan, are you serious?" "Yes, it sounds crazy. I know, no, listen to me," Emily interrupted again. "I know about the mirror. My grandmother had one just like it. She got rid of it years ago, but she told me stories about it. About the people inside." Ethan froze. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know all the details," Emily continued, her voice hurried now. "But my grandmother said the mirror was cursed. She saw things in it, people, just like you. She said the mirror was a window, or maybe a door. She said the people in it were trapped, but they were trying to get out." Ethan's pulse quickened. His grip on the phone tightened. "What happened to the mirror?" "She gave it away. I think she said she sold it at a flea market. That was years ago, but Ethan, you need to get rid of it. Whatever you do, don't let it stay with you. Don't let them out." A cold chill washed over Ethan. He stared at the mirror across the room, the figures still standing inside, watching him, waiting. The woman's hand was still pressed against the glass, and his reflection, it wasn't his anymore. "I don't think I can stop it," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Then get out of there. Now." The call ended, but Ethan stood frozen in place, the weight of Emily's words pressing down on him. The watchers weren't just looking through the mirror anymore. They were trying to break free. And Ethan wasn't sure if he had the strength to stop them. The days after Ethan's conversation with Emily passed in a haze of anxiety and dread. The knowledge that she had heard similar stories about the mirror, stories from her own family, only deepened his fear. He couldn't shake her words. "Get rid of it. Whatever you do, don't let them out." But getting rid of the mirror wasn't as simple as it sounded. It wasn't just an object to him anymore. It was something more. A puzzle he couldn't leave unsolved. A presence he couldn't escape. The watchers had become part of his life, and the more he tried to ignore them, the stronger their pull became. The nights were the worst. The watchers didn't always appear during the day, but at night, they never failed to show themselves. Each time they were clearer, more vivid, more aware of him. And now, they moved more freely in the reflection. They weren't just standing anymore, they shifted, their heads turning to follow his movements, their eyes locked on him. The woman's hand remained pressed against the glass, as though she was testing the boundary between their world and his. Ethan couldn't sleep. Every sound in the apartment made him jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch and creep toward him. The cold air around the mirror felt like it was spreading throughout the entire apartment, chilling him to the bone. One evening, as the moonlight streamed through his windows, Ethan found himself standing in front of the mirror again. He hadn't planned to be there, but he couldn't help it anymore. It was like the mirror was calling to him, pulling him closer. He stared at his reflection, his real reflection this time, not the distorted version he'd seen before. But the watchers were there too, clearer than ever. The tall man stood closest, his face expressionless, while the woman's hand remained pressed against the glass. Behind them, the other figures shifted and moved in the shadows. Ethan's breath was shallow. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't tear himself away. He stepped closer to the mirror, his eyes locked on the woman's hand, wondering what would happen if she managed to break through. And then, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like the rustling of wind through the trees. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the mirror. The watchers weren't speaking with their mouths. They never moved their lips, but the sound of their voices filled the room, surrounding Ethan, making his skin crawl. He couldn't make out the words at first, but as he listened closer, they became clearer. "Help us." The voice was soft, almost pleading. It wasn't like the cold, hollow presence of the watchers. It was different, gentler, desperate. Ethan's eyes widened. He leaned in closer to the mirror, his breath fogging the glass. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The whispering continued, overlapping voices swirling around him, but one stood out. The woman's. He could feel it, even though her mouth never moved. Trapped? We're trapped? Ethan's heart raced. His mind struggled to grasp what was happening. The figures in the mirror, they weren't just watching him. They were reaching out to him, asking for help. "How?" he asked, his voice shaky. "How can I help you?" The woman's hand pressed harder against the glass, the outline of her fingers clearer now. The air around the mirror grew colder, and Ethan could feel the pull, stronger than ever before. The boundary between their world and his was thinning, weakening. "Free us," the woman whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. "Break the mirror?" Ethan stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. Break the mirror? That was the key? But the vendor had warned him that destroying it could have dangerous consequences. If the watchers were truly trapped inside, what would happen if he set them free? "Break it," the voice insisted, more urgent now. "Please." Ethan's thoughts spun. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to leave the mirror alone, but the woman's voice was so convincing, so desperate. She sounded like a victim, like someone who had been trapped for too long and was begging for release. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you trapped? What will happen if I break it?" The whispering grew louder, more chaotic. The watchers in the mirror seemed agitated, shifting and moving faster, their expressions still unreadable, but their presence more intense. The tall man stepped closer, his face almost touching the glass, and Ethan felt a wave of cold wash over him. "Break it, before it's too late," the woman's voice pleaded. But Ethan hesitated. Something wasn't right. He could feel it deep in his gut. The watchers had never spoken to him before, never tried to communicate in this way. Why now? Why this sudden desperation? His mind raced back to Emily's warning, "Don't let them out." Ethan stared at the mirror, his reflection wavering as he fought the overwhelming urge to obey the voice. He had to think. He had to make the right choice. The whispering intensified, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, all blending together. But through the noise, one thought stood out. If he broke the mirror, whatever was on the other side would be free. And once free, he had no idea what they would do. Ethan backed away from the mirror, his hands trembling. The woman's face pressed closer to the glass, her wide, hollow eyes pleading with him. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't." The whispering stopped suddenly, the air in the room growing heavy with silence. The figures in the mirror stood still, their eyes locked on him, their expressions unreadable. The woman's hand remained pressed against the glass, but now there was something different about her. Her face, once pleading, now seemed colder. Darker. Ethan shivered as a new thought took hold of him. Maybe the watchers weren't asking for freedom. Maybe they were demanding it. Ethan didn't sleep that night. After the encounter with the woman in the mirror and her desperate plea to break it, he spent hours pacing the floor, his mind racing, heart pounding. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The watchers were becoming more persistent, more aggressive. Their presence had shifted from passive observation to something much darker. The mirror was no longer just a window. It was something more, a door. And it was opening. By the early hours of the morning, Ethan was sitting on his couch, staring at the mirror from across the room. He hadn't dared approach it again since the woman's voice had filled his mind, but he couldn't stop watching. Every flicker of shadow, every hint of movement in the reflection sent chills down his spine. He had to make a decision. He couldn't live like this, not with the Watchers pressing against the boundaries of his world. They wanted something from him, something he wasn't sure he was willing to give. But the whispering continued, faint and distant now, like a low hum in the back of his mind. It was as if they knew he was hesitating, waiting for him to make a choice. "Break it," the voice echoed in his thoughts again, but this time it wasn't just pleading, it was demanding. Ethan stood abruptly, his legs shaky, and moved to the kitchen. He needed to clear his head, to think rationally. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe the only way to stop this was to destroy the mirror. But what would happen if he did? What would be unleashed? As he poured himself a glass of water, a sharp noise from the living room made him freeze. The sound was faint, like a soft tapping, but it was unmistakable. His heart raced as he set the glass down and turned toward the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the mirror. Ethan took a slow, cautious step toward the living room, his breath caught in his throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if someone, or something, was on the other side, knocking, trying to get in. His stomach twisted with dread. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, as though whatever was inside the mirror knew exactly what it was doing. And then, without warning, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick with tension. Ethan stood frozen, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But what came next was far worse. The air in the room grew colder, and a slow creaking sound filled the space. Ethan's eyes darted to the mirror. The surface of the glass seemed to ripple, distorting the reflection as though it were made of liquid, not solid glass. The shadowy figures in the mirror shifted, their forms moving closer, their presence more palpable than ever. Suddenly, the tall man with the angular face stepped forward, his dark eyes locking onto Ethan's. The man's hand pressed against the glass, just as the woman's had, but this time the pressure was stronger, more forceful. A hairline crack splintered across the mirror's surface, the sound sharp and violent. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair in his panic. The crack in the mirror spread, spider webbing outward, as the man in the reflection continued to press harder. For the first time, the Watchers moved with purpose. The woman was there, too, her face close to the glass, her eyes wide with something that looked like hunger. They weren't just watching anymore, they were trying to get out. The tapping returned, louder now, more frantic, like someone pounding on a door, demanding to be let in. Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed a kitchen chair and held it defensively in front of him, though he knew it was futile. Whatever was happening, the mirror wasn't going to hold much longer. The whispering became a roar, voices overlapping, filling his head with chaotic demands. "Free us. Let us in. Break the mirror." Ethan felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the noise, by the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. The mirror was no longer a mere object in his apartment. It was a portal, a gateway to something dark and terrible. And that something was breaking through. He had to stop it. Desperation overtook him as he dropped the chair and ran toward the hallway closet. He flung open the door and grabbed a hammer from his toolbox, his hands trembling. If breaking the mirror was the only way to end this nightmare, he had no other choice. But as he returned to the living room, hammer in hand, the whispering changed. The voices became angrier, more hostile. The woman's once pleading voice now echoed with venom. "Break it, and you will join us." Ethan's grip tightened on the hammer as he stared at the mirror. The Watchers were practically pressed against the glass now, their faces contorted with rage. The crack in the mirror deepened, spreading across the entire surface, but it didn't shatter. The barrier was still holding, barely. He hesitated, his mind torn. If he broke the mirror, would he really be freeing them? Or would he be dooming himself? A loud thud reverberated through the apartment as something slammed into the mirror from the other side. The glass bulged outward, warping under the pressure. The tall man's hand was nearly pushing through. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He had no time to think. He had to act. With a primal scream, he raised the hammer and swung it toward the mirror with all his strength. But just before the hammer made contact, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped even further, leaving Ethan in a bone-chilling cold. The whispering stopped. The mirror was silent. Ethan stood there, frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't see the mirror in the darkness, but he could feel it. He could feel the Watchers, closer than ever. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he could make out the faint outline of the mirror's frame. The crack in the glass had stopped spreading, but the surface seemed to shimmer, as if the glass was alive. And then, from the darkness, a single voice whispered, clear and cold. "You're too late." The floor beneath him seemed to shift, and Ethan's knees buckled. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in on him. The Watchers weren't just trying to break through anymore. They were already here. The next morning came, but Ethan felt like he hadn't truly left the night behind. The darkness clung to him, even in daylight, seeping into his bones. The memory of the Watchers pressing against the mirror, the crack spreading, and that final whisper, "You're too late," haunted him. He was losing control. The Watchers weren't just trying to get out. They were succeeding. For hours, he sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he stared at the hammer he had dropped in the middle of the living room. He could still feel the cold that had radiated from the mirror, the oppressive presence of the Watchers just beyond the glass. He had been ready to smash it, but now he wasn't sure what that would unleash. "If I break the mirror, I join them," Ethan muttered, replaying the warning in his head. It wasn't just about freeing them, it was about keeping himself from being trapped inside. Destroying the mirror wouldn't be the escape he had hoped for. The vendor's voice echoed in his mind. "Mirrors like that don't break easy." But if breaking the mirror wasn't an option, then what? How could he stop them? His phone buzzed on the table, the sudden sound breaking through his swirling thoughts. He grabbed it quickly, hoping for some distraction, but when he saw the name on the screen, his heart sank. Emily. He hadn't spoken to her since their last conversation, since she'd warned him about the mirror and her grandmother's experience with it. He wasn't sure he was ready to explain what had happened since. But part of him needed to hear her voice, needed someone to ground him in reality. With a deep breath, Ethan answered the call. "Ethan," Emily's voice came through, tense and urgent. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you okay?" He hesitated. Was he okay? Could anyone be okay after what he'd been through? I don't know, he finally admitted. "It's worse than I thought. The Watchers, they're not just trapped. They're trying to get out." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Emily spoke again, her voice was laced with fear. "Ethan, you need to get away from that mirror. You need to leave, now. If they're close to breaking through, it's only going to get worse." "I tried," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "I tried to smash it last night, but something stopped me. They said if I break it, I'll join them. I don't know what to do." "You can't stay there," Emily insisted. "The mirror is cursed. It's not just about the Watchers, it's a trap. My grandmother told me once that the mirror doesn't just hold them. It pulls people in. Anyone who spends too much time with it, their soul gets caught inside." Ethan's stomach churned. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The strange feeling he'd had when staring into the mirror for hours, the moments when his reflection seemed off, delayed, it wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. It was the mirror trying to take him. "I think they're getting closer," Ethan whispered. "Last night, the mirror cracked. The Watchers, they're almost through." Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "You need help. This is bigger than either of us. You need someone who knows how to deal with this, an expert, someone who can banish whatever's in that mirror." "An expert?" Ethan asked, barely able to focus. "There's someone," Emily said quickly. "I've been doing some research since we last spoke. There's a paranormal investigator, her name's Lydia Crane. She's dealt with things like this before. Spirits, cursed objects. I think she could help you." Ethan's mind raced. Could someone like that really help? Could this mirror be exorcised, the Watchers banished? At this point, he had no other options. "How do I find her?" he asked, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in days. "I already reached out to her for you," Emily replied. "She's in town. She can meet you at your apartment in an hour. But you have to be ready. If she's going to stop this, you have to be prepared for whatever it takes." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Okay, I'll do whatever it takes." "Good," Emily said, relief in her voice. "But Ethan, whatever happens, don't let them touch you. Don't let them pull you in." An hour later, Ethan stood at the door of his apartment, waiting anxiously for Lydia Crane to arrive. The mirror was silent, the crack still visible but no longer spreading. The Watchers weren't there, yet, but Ethan could feel their presence just beneath the surface. It was only a matter of time before they tried again. A sharp knock at the door made him jump. He opened it to find a woman standing in the hallway. She was in her late 30s, dressed in black, with piercing eyes and a calm, confident demeanor. She carried a small leather bag slung over her shoulder and looked as though she'd seen more than her fair share of the supernatural. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice steady. He nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Lydia glanced around the apartment, her gaze immediately falling on the mirror. "This is it?" she asked, moving toward it without hesitation. Ethan followed her, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "Yeah, that's it. They're in there." Lydia crouched down in front of the mirror, examining the crack in the surface of the glass. She muttered something under her breath before standing up and turning to face Ethan. "This is bad," she said bluntly. "Very bad." Ethan swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Lydia set her bag down on the floor and opened it, pulling out a few objects: a bundle of herbs, a small vial of liquid, and a piece of chalk. "We're going to try to seal the mirror, to close off whatever connection the Watchers have to our world. But I need you to understand something. If this doesn't work, the only other option is to destroy the mirror, and if that happens, I can't guarantee what will come through before we finish." Ethan's heart pounded. "And if we don't destroy it?" "If we don't," Lydia said, her voice calm but serious, "they'll take you." The air in the room grew colder as she spoke, and Ethan felt a familiar shiver run down his spine. He glanced at the mirror and saw movement. The Watchers were back. Their faces were pressed against the glass, their eyes locked on him. There was no turning back now. The apartment was suffused with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the faint hum of Lydia Crane's low murmurs as she prepared her tools. The air felt dense, cold, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Ethan stood by the wall, watching Lydia trace strange symbols on the floor in chalk around the mirror. "You need to stay outside the circle," Lydia warned, her voice calm but firm. "Once I start the ritual, the Watchers will push harder to break through. We're going to try to seal them back in. But if anything goes wrong, if they get out, you need to leave. Don't look back. Understand?" Ethan nodded, but his legs felt like they were filled with lead. The mirror loomed in the center of the circle, its surface rippling faintly as the Watchers gathered behind it. Their faces were clearer than ever, pressed close to the glass, their eyes locked on Ethan. The tall man, the woman with the dark hair, and countless other shadowy figures were all there, staring at him with an intensity that chilled him to the bone. Lydia lit a small bundle of herbs and began to chant under her breath, her movements methodical as she sprinkled the vial of liquid across the chalk lines. Ethan could feel the shift in the room, the weight of something pressing down on them, as though the Watchers knew what was happening and were fighting against it. The crack in the mirror, jagged and threatening, seemed to pulse, as if the glass itself was alive. The surface warped and flexed, the Watchers pushing harder, their forms straining against the glass. The woman's hand pressed against the crack, her fingers digging into the glass as though she was trying to claw her way through. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. Lydia's face was tense, her concentration absolute. But Ethan could see the strain in her eyes. The Watchers were fighting back. Suddenly, the air in the room changed. A low, guttural whisper filled the space, not from Lydia, but from the mirror. The Watchers were speaking, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, dissonant chorus. "Let us out." The crack in the mirror widened. The glass seemed to bow outward, bulging as though it was ready to burst. Ethan felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. Lydia's chant faltered for just a moment, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she shouted to Ethan without breaking her focus. "They're stronger than I thought." Ethan felt helpless, standing outside the circle, watching as the mirror began to fracture further. The figures inside moved more violently, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands pounding against the glass. The woman's face was contorted with rage now, her eyes fixed on Ethan, her lips forming a single word over and over again: break. Ethan's mind raced. The Watchers were too close. He could feel it, feel their hunger, their need to escape. He glanced down at the hammer still lying on the floor where he had dropped it the night before. It felt like an impossible decision: destroy the mirror and risk unleashing them, or let them continue to torment him, waiting for the inevitable moment when they'd break through on their own. "Lydia," Ethan called, his voice shaking. "I don't think this is working." Lydia didn't answer. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead as she chanted louder, the symbols on the floor glowing faintly under the weight of the ritual. But the Watchers weren't slowing down. If anything, they were growing stronger. Suddenly, the tall man's hand burst through the crack in the mirror, the glass shattering outward. His fingers, long and skeletal, reached toward the circle's boundary, twisting and clawing at the air. Ethan's heart stopped. The watchers were breaking through. Lydia's protection was failing. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed the hammer from the floor, his body moving before his mind could catch up. The cold weight of it in his hands felt final, like the beginning of an end he wasn't ready for. "Ethan, no!" Lydia screamed, breaking her chant, her eyes wide with panic. "If you break it," but it was too late. The watchers were already breaking free. The tall man's arm pushed further through the crack, his gaunt face visible now, eyes black and hollow, lips curling into a grotesque smile. "You're ours," the whisper echoed. With a primal yell, Ethan swung the hammer with all his strength, aiming directly at the center of the mirror. The impact was deafening. Glass exploded outward, shards flying across the room like jagged pieces of ice. For a split second, everything was still, suspended in the chaos of the moment. And then the screaming began. Not from Ethan or Lydia, but from the watchers. The figures in the mirror shrieked in unison, their faces contorting in agony as the glass shattered. The tall man's arm disintegrated into nothingness, and the woman's hand, once so desperate to break free, dissolved into smoke. The air around Ethan felt like it was being sucked into a vacuum, the temperature plummeting as the figures in the mirror twisted and writhed, their forms breaking apart, pulled back into the void. Lydia stumbled back, her body collapsing against the wall as the force of the broken mirror seemed to pull everything toward it. The shards of glass on the floor shimmered with a strange light, vibrating as if caught in an invisible wind. Ethan stood in the center of it all, the hammer still clutched in his hands, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The mirror was gone, destroyed. But the watchers were too. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The coldness in the air began to lift, the oppressive weight of the watchers' presence fading. But something else lingered, an emptiness, a void where the mirror had once been. Lydia slowly pushed herself to her feet, her body trembling. "It's over," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Ethan dropped the hammer, the sound of it hitting the floor barely registering in his mind. His body felt numb, his mind fogged with exhaustion and disbelief. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice weak. Lydia nodded, though her expression was grim. "The mirror is destroyed. They can't come through now." But Ethan wasn't sure. Something inside him felt off. The watchers were gone, but a strange emptiness had settled in their place, like a part of him had been left behind with them. He glanced at the shattered glass on the floor. His reflection, fragmented and distorted, stared back at him from 1,000 pieces. And for just a moment, just a flicker, he thought he saw something watching him from the other side. Thanks for watching. If you like this scary tale and want more, don't forget to like and subscribe.